Well, you're probably tired of looking at us. We're tired of staring into our cameras. We did an almost 4-hour live stream this week, and thousands of you tuned in for it. So thank you for that. We had fun. Jen and I both felt pretty good the next day. Is that fair to say? Did you feel okay the next day?
I mean, my alcohol tolerance is literally so low that I don't get hungover because I can't drink enough to get hungover. But I mean, speak for yourself on having fun. I don't really remember anything I said or did that night.
I had fun. I think you had fun. The one advantage you had the next morning, like basically I threw you the keys the next morning. I'm like, please just do the work. You have a 2-hour advantage on me. You can sleep longer.
I do. And I'm a total night owl too, as well. You know, I will be up until midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, very happily, especially before I had kids. And then I'm useless before 10 a.m.
I'm by inclination a night hawk too, but just with kids, you can't be. What was interesting was the last summer before COVID. So 2019, my wife was gone for a few days with both my kids. It was like 4 days. And it was the first time at the time, like 7 years, I'd been kidless for that long. And I realized, and I also had vacation that week. It was my first at liberty time, no work or family obligations in like 7 years. And the first night I was like, this is glorious. And I went to bed at 10 o'clock, had a wonderful sleep. Next night I went to bed at like 11:30, had a wonderful sleep. The next night I went to bed at 1:30 and had a wonderful sleep. I will reset to being a night hawk given the slightest opportunity. But it's not possible now. So I got about 5 hours. I wasn't hungover after the live stream. I was exhausted. Like I only slept about 5 hours, and I haven't been sleeping well lately because of all that going on. Well, let's speak about some of the. Well, let's talk about O'Toole in a minute because we just talked about it for 4 hours earlier in the week. Let's talk convoy.
Convoy. So I think you and I have. We are much more alarmed by what we see on the imminent horizon than I think a lot of our friends and colleagues are, because to me, I read that press conference by the Ottawa police chief as him admitting there's no way to end this without it getting bloody, and I don't want to take responsibility for it. So please, Army, come and eat this particular shit sandwich, is kind of how I read that.
There's another way to read it. And first of all, I don't disagree with you. That's a completely legitimate read. Here's another possible read. We're talking about Peter Slowly, the chief of police in Ottawa, said on Wednesday, I guess. We're filming this late on Thursday, just in case we get overtaken by news developments. But he said yesterday or Wednesday that there might not be a policing solution. That was his exact quote. Mm-hmm. At the time, I looked at that. I'm like, okay, well, there's two ways to look at that. One of them is that we need a negotiated solution. Another one is that he's calling in the Army. And then I tweeted that right at the time. And then later on, he was more explicit. No, he meant the armed forces. That what that could also be viewed as, though, is not so much a confession of ineptitude, so much as it, or helplessness. He could just be going, fuck y'all. Like, you know, we have seen in Ottawa, people are outraged, I think with good reason. They're not even handing out parking tickets. They're not even handing out like citations for public nuisance here. Is Slowly doing that because he doesn't want to, or has he been directed not to? I don't know. But one guy who I know, who's a guy with a lot of years of police experience, just said to me, you have to remember, if you're chief of police of a major metropolitan Canadian force, it's not because of your police skills. It's because of your political skills. So the guy who's best at catching bad guys does not become chief of police. The best politician in the police force works his way up through the power structure.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense. I mean, the other interesting thing in all of this is that
just want to do it.
Yeah, sorry, just 1 second. My little one just came home from school. Anyway, the other thing I would just point out, and I said this on Twitter, and I think it generally holds true, is that like people are the right is, it's so funny. The right is saying, what are you talking about? These guys are getting kid gloves. Have you not been paying attention to all of the standoffs and church burnings and much more violent protests that have happened in recent months, who all got a pass, even though these guys were actually committing violence? And yes, Jamie.
You want a surprise for me?
I got what for you?
Pie. Surprise.
A pies?
No, surprise.
Oh, a surprise? I will find a surprise for you, okay? But right now, Mommy's on the phone. You're gonna have to wait, okay? Can you give mommy a kiss?
Hey, Jamie.
You say hi to Matt.
Hey, buddy.
No, hi to Matt.
I want a pie too, though.
He wants a surprise.
I want a. He can have a surprise. I want a pie.
Oh, okay. Are you just staring at Matt?
I'm gonna stare off here.
Gonna stare off? Can you go downstairs while mommy's on the phone, please?
We can't use copyrighted music.
Thank you. Love you.
Apparently,
Apparently, I gotta come up with a surprise.
that stare down there. I want to do ELO's Showdown. I don't know if you're up to Electric Light Orchestra. It's more my 70s thing, but it'd be a good song for that minute. But it's copyrighted, and YouTube would not like it. So what we're talking about the right wing.
I was just saying, like, you've got the people on the right being like, I mean, look, we have had actual protests that got violent and significantly disrupted severe and legitimate corridors like pipeline and railway corridors. And those protesters got treated like kid gloves. These protesters are, by comparison, frankly, not violent. And I still wouldn't classify at this point, as of Thursday at 4:02 p.m. Mountain Standard Times, I would not classify this protest as being a violent protest. It's certainly been highly disruptive and highly problematic. And I'm not, undermining or minimizing how inconvenient it's been and how difficult it's been for the people living in Ottawa, but it's not violent yet. And then you've got people on the right saying, if this were a BLM protest or an I don't know more protest, you'd have the police coming in cracking heads. Personally, I think that is just absurd. The last BLM protest that happened in the middle of the pandemic, the prime minister showed up and took a knee. So yeah. I don't think that that's very likely, but we could all point to different historic precedents of police sort of under or overreacting depending on the issue. The takeaway that I have for all of this is that how the police react to any protest is a 90% about logistics, and maybe 10% about ideology, if that. Maybe 10, more the better way to put it would be 10% politics. I think the logistics and the risk calculation is a much more brutal and crass assessment process. Yeah. And the major problem with the convoy in Ottawa is that they're sitting on several hundred trucks. This is a real logistical problem if you are a relatively small, city police force.
You know what? I agree with you. I agree with you right through. Now, which is before we get cream for this, because people will take this the wrong way. We're not denying that there's problems with racial disparities and outcomes with police forces.
Oh God, no! No.
He's a white dude wandering the city has a much easier ride with the local constabulary than a random black dude would. And
we can talk about police carding and all those sorts of things. We're talking specifically about how police respond to protests.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's what we're talking about specifically.
The problem is, I was saying to you before we got rolling here, this is just a great example of one of my meta problems with the current state of humanity, which is all of our arguments are stupid. All the arguments we have immediately, it's sort of like a Goodwin rule, like or is it Godwin or Goodwin? But like when someone immediately, whatever it is, someone immediately cites the Nazis. I think we have to have like an updated version of that where someone just immediately takes the argument to the maximalist stupid position, right? Because I saw a tweet, and I'm not gonna blast the guy because he was just a random. He was just a guy in Ottawa, but I guess he channeled the frustration and got retweeted by the right people. It ended up getting thousands and thousands of retweets. But the point he was making was, if this was an idle no more protest, the police would have cleared them out by now. But because they haven't, now they have hundreds of trucks and they are immovable. And I'm like, oh, dude, you're so close. Like you're almost there. Like, and I think for most people, and I'm trying to be very charitable here, most people have strong feelings on the police as an institution. Like it's part of how we tend to view things. I, as a conservative, have typically been overly deferential to police. And this is something I've learned, and I try to gut check myself, but I have a reflexive sympathy for police. Also, half my family are cops. So that's something I have to kind of consciously gut check. And I think I've gotten better over the years, but people will be their own judge. But other people out there reflexively dislike the police. And they see for any number of reasons, some of them valid. And we're looking at the situation and we're all bringing our priors to it and going, well, the police are making me happy because they're doing the thing I like, or the police are making me angry because they're doing the thing I don't like here. The thing that is different about Ottawa are the trucks. If this was a matter of like, there's like, according to the reports I was looking at on Thursday, there's somewhere between 200 and 300 protesters left in Ottawa. If this was a crowd control issue,
No problem.
no problem.
Out in an hour.
Dozens, maybe hundreds of vehicles, reports say some of them have been disabled to make them impossibly to move in a confined area. That's a problem here. And if you want to go back and if you want to find examples of the police overreacting to a protest where the participants were not white, you can easily do that. And then you can use that to tell your narrative of, and therefore these white people are getting kid glove treatment. It's the trucks, stupid. It is the wild card here. And I am not denying any problems with racial disparity in police outcomes here, but there is something unique about this situation, and it's the trucks.
Well,
and other people have noticed. There's convoys headed now for my city, for your city, for Quebec City. The trucks are the thing, and people have
the trucks can basically shut things down. That's just what it is. I mean, the other thing that I'd point out is back in the day when I was covering the Occupy protests in Calgary, there was, I mean, the Occupy protests took over parks for weeks and weeks and weeks. Yes. There was a lot of pressure, especially from conservatives, to say, get those people out, get these people out. This is ridiculous that they're still in the city. Just, clear out the tents, clear out the whatever. And even in that situation, the cops were super cautious and the bylaw officers were super cautious. And I remember there was one day when we were all expecting this final standoff to come, like the bylaw officers had warned, we're coming on X day this morning. And they came in force. And it was a big dramatic thing. And they just handed out tickets. And then they left. And then I went and I talked to the bylaw officer at the time, Bill.
I know exactly why they were doing that.
And I said, well, I don't understand. You guys made a big show about how you were going to kick these people
out.
We made
a big show and we saw who showed up.
Yeah, exactly. And all you did was give them tickets. And they were like, no, you don't understand. We were just seeing what forces they could assemble to oppose us and how violent. And we were trying to do a risk assessment on how violent. I mean, I'm sure there were probably spotters up on the ceiling looking for weapons and things like that. So they were using this stunt as a risk assessment tool. So it wasn't that they were going easy on the protesters. There was a tactical reason why they were doing the things they were doing. I don't know what the tactical reasons for why the Ottawa police is doing or what it's not doing in this particular point. It could very well be that they're just doing intelligence gathering at this point. I don't know.
I want to be clear. I don't mean to speak for you, but I think we're on the same page here. This should not be sound like us defending the Ottawa police.
Oh God, no.
In this specific instance, I think they're fucking this up. I think the Ottawa police is doing this badly, but in general, some of the commentary about the Ottawa police is also bad. Like I've been looking at for days now, people saying, why didn't we block off Wellington Street or Avenue? Whatever. I think it's Wellington Street. Of course you can. You can do that. And then when the thousands of trucks arrive, where do they go? This is controlling, or someone is saying, why didn't we close? Why did we let them into the city? Because no one entering the city has broken the law.
Yeah.
People, it's okay to criticize the Ottawa police for what they get wrong here. But in a free society, you can't stop the people from showing up to do the illegal thing until they show up and begin doing the illegal thing. Can you block the streets? Yeah, you can. And then you push 200 of these trucks into a residential neighborhood.
I mean, the other thing is, I said, I'm not trying to defend or not defend the Ottawa police. I'm reserving judgment on the Ottawa police's handling of this until I see how it's resolved. That's what I would say. But what I would also say is, like I said, just going back to my original point, practical logistics, I think counts way more in how the police are going to respond to any given protest than any other thing. And a bunch of unarmed people camped in a park are going to get treated differently than an armed standoff, because the risk assessment is just going to be radically different in those situations.
It's interesting because something else in a similar vein to this, there's been a lot of people talking about the G20 in Toronto and saying, hey, look at the G20, people went in, cracked heads. The G20 response in Toronto has been called a police riot. The police went rioting, the police went bonkers. Yeah. Wildly disproportionate use of force, complete violations of charter rights, stupid strategy. Not a good moment. And people are kind of like, well, why did they act in the G20 in one way and then in Ottawa in another way? And one of the things I don't think people appreciate is that one of the reasons they're responding differently in Ottawa is because of the fucking G20. The G20 was something that was a disaster for the reputation of police. There were inquiries. The guy in Ottawa, the chief there, was a Toronto cop during the G20 here. The G20, again, and I'm not denying the racial disparities here, but if you expect Ottawa to be a repeat of the G20, you're assuming that the consequences and the aftermath and the fallout of the G20 never existed. The more interesting comparison to me was just before COVID hit. You probably remember the blockade near Belleville, where there was a rail. I don't remember exactly how long it was, but I did look up. Eventually, I had to refresh myself because 2 years of insanity since then. I think a couple weeks of rail disruptions in Eastern Canada because of this blockade. And they didn't block
seriously challenges to food supply was actually the real issue. Like you had the railways literally warning, if you guys don't clear the railways, grocery stores are going to go empty.
In Atlantic Canada. Canada is at the end of a very long supply route. And ultimately, after however long it was, I'll look that up when we write the dispatch, but it was a while. The police went in, they made one guy had to be physically restrained. They made 10 other arrests and released them all on recognizances for to return at a later date. It was a heavy-handed police response against a small number of people, but it was not like walking in, swinging bats around. Police strategy has been changing dramatically since the G20. It's not great. It's not perfect. You can point to examples of the Coastal GasLink, the Wet'suwet'en, which you've already mentioned. But there's another issue there. The Wet'suwet'en standoffs have companies, like powerful companies, getting court injunctions that compel the police. If a Starbucks on Wellington Street gets an injunction from the court to send in the cops, things might get ugly. A couple of things just worth mentioning here, and just to your point about tactics and circumstances, I don't want to dunk on the guy. He's a reporter for one of the local outlets, and I've actually been following his coverage and all. I think he's been doing good coverage, but he had a really bad tweet where he's like, I remember when 13 people in an intersection were immediately arrested and moved out, and the police are allowing hundreds of people in trucks to occupy our downtown. Well, yeah, because 13 people in an intersection can be scooped up and moved out. Hundreds of people in trucks can't be.
The other complicating factor here is that we know this, and we know the police chief actually said this as well, is that there's a very good chance that this protest has been deeply infiltrated by alt-right figures who might be bringing weapons and who are there for a fight. So that changes the risk assessment. Maybe not, but that potentially changes the risk assessment dramatically in all of this, because essentially the concern here is that they start clearing out these trucks or seizing some of these trucks, and that leads to an actual street fight with 20 people dead. And trust me, if you want to see an angry, polarized populace, wait until a couple of these truckers get killed by cops. That's going to be a radically different, kind of much angrier scenario than what we are in right now. That only gets worse from here.
It's interesting. I got a few more notes jotted down on this. I want to mention this one briefly. You tell me if you think this is too nerdy, and we can leave it out of the dispatch if it's too nerdy. Now that Slowly has raised the possibility of calling in the armed forces, I've watched including some smart people who ought to have known better, try to immediately, like I said before, instead of viewing this as logistics, people jump to politics. And I'm watching people kind of going, well, the prime minister would never allow that because of the optics of this. No. Like, we have laws in this country, and I know we're having trouble enforcing them, but if the civil authority calls out the armed forces, there's a protocol for that. And I had a woman today in Ottawa trying to explain to me that it won't happen because that's not how we do policing in this country. Well, here's someone who's never heard of the Oka crisis. Here's someone who's never heard of the FLQ crisis. There is, in the National Defense Act, specific language about how and when the military can be called out to provide reinforcements to police, specifically because of riots or disturbances. There are different scenarios. Like if there's a flood and we need a bunch of soldiers to go sandbag some stuff, okay, there's a protocol for that. But if we are calling out the armed forces to aid civilian authorities because specifically a riot or disturbance, there's a protocol for that. And what people don't realize, and this is interesting, the federal government actually does not get a say. It goes from a provincial attorney general directly to the commander of the armed forces. The commander of the armed forces is required to assist. It's not discretionary. He is obligated to assist, but he can choose the form, nature, and duration of the assistance. So if he doesn't want his hands on it, like he can send like some poor lieutenant right out of the the RMC, and basically go, oh, you're my response, you're the observer. But if the military were to deem we needed to send in thousands of infantry, that's at the military's discretion under the National Defense Act. The federal cabinet is not involved in that decision. Now, we're not idiots. They would lean on them and they would try to have influence, but a provincial attorney general making a request to the chief of the defense staff, the chief of the defense staff is obligated to respond. Do you think that's too nerdy, or do you think people actually would care?
No, I actually think that that is an incredibly important point. I think that you should totally make that point. I think that's going to be crucial. The other thing that I want you to write about, although maybe in a column form, and again, we discussed this a little bit last night, is what are the nonviolent options for de-escalation here? And I mean, you came up with a perfectly reasonable option that I think is worthwhile.
Or should I save it for the column?
I think you should save it for the column, but like I think that you and your military mind and your sort of tactical mind is probably a good person to write that column.
One other point worth making on this, then we'll move on. It's the last item on my list of notes here. Having some, you've mentioned this a little bit, kind of how in Ottawa, the rhetoric is very high from members of the community. And I understand intellectually the frustration. Look, I haven't had horns outside my house blaring for 5 days, so I'm not going to pretend I understand, but I get it. I get why people are frustrated, disruption to business, harassment, irritations, and things like that. I've been watching a lot of the, what we could call the Ottawa elite, the blue checks, expressing their frustration, which I accept is genuine. And I just keep thinking one word in my head, looking at people being like, how can the police have abandoned us? How can they have let this happen? Where is the law enforcement response? I feel like we're on our own here. Caledonia.
Mm-hmm.
The only word I'm thinking of here. And I know people are going to go, well, that was an Indigenous land claim issue. It's totally different. Like, I'm not saying the root causes are the same. I am not saying the circumstances are at all comparable. What I am saying is, if you think this is the first time residents of a Canadian community have felt like the police have completely abandoned them, all it is proof that we have very, very short memories. Our former colleague, Christy Blatchford, who died a few years ago, wrote that book, Helpless, about what it was like to be living in Caledonia during the land claim dispute, where the OPP, as Dalton McGuinty told me to my face in a meeting, he said the police were keeping the peace. I said, that's not their job. Military keeps the peace. The police enforce the law. And Dalton McGuinty went, gave me that little Dalton McGuinty smile. If you are shocked that the police are letting a Canadian community suffer because they won't enforce the laws in favor of keeping the peace, you weren't paying attention during Caledonia. And I know it was a different situation, but this part of it's actually exactly the same.
Well, and what's also very interesting is just the vulnerability of Canada and our capacity issues, right? Like this is a deeper thing that we've been touching on with the line, or with the line for the last couple of months. The last few months have just revealed to us how deeply inadequate our institutional capacities are, and how shallow a lot of that stuff is. And this should now be coming home to you in a very real way. We just have a questionable capacity to deal with. A couple hundred truckers is all it takes.
It's interesting though. Yes, I agree entirely. I did have a chat with a buddy, someone who's not in the military, not a cop, but he's a longtime municipal politico. And what he said, it was a really interesting insight. He said to me, here's actually an example, because he knows we write a lot about state capacity. He actually pinged me about this, and he goes, this is a great example to you of your capacity thesis. But he goes, this is a unique example, because the Ottawa police is actually appropriately manned and staffed. They have access to reinforcements they've called in from Toronto, from the Ontario Provincial Police, the Mounties, I think as far away as London, Ontario. They've sent reinforcements. This is not a manpower issue in Ottawa right now. They would have the manpower to move if they wanted to. Equipment, yeah, they probably don't have the heavy tow vehicles on hand that they would need. They could requisition them. It would be possible for us to build up the capacity here. This is the other side of the capacity coin. It's the willingness side. So there are times when the politicians are frantically pulling the levers of power and they're not connected to anything. This is an example of the same problem, but in reverse. We have levers. They are connected. No one wants to pull them. I
think that my suspicion is that goes right back to the risk assessment. These guys are worried that you know, of the 200 truckers, 20 of them are packing AKs and grenades. Like, you know what I mean? Like I think that that's actually what's happening here. And this is, again, I don't want to absolve or sound like I'm absolving the Ottawa Police for its inaction. I think, as I said, I'm just reserving judgment on the action until I see how this ends, because I think that there's a pretty good possibility that the reason why they're not moving on any of this stuff is because they're intelligence gathering,
or they're afraid. I mean,
or they're afraid, or they're legitimately just like, I'm afraid that if I start ticketing these guys, I'm going to get shot in the head, and that's not worth my life.
So we're filming this Thursday evening, my time, Thursday afternoon, your time. They have started handing out noise citations and parking citations today, which I know people have been demanding they do all week. And it's just, I understand why they're frustrated. There was a great tweet of lament from a journalist who was covering it and had been writing all day about how they had not been handing out any tickets. And then he went back to his car and he got a parking ticket. So he said, I guess I should have hung a Confederate flag off my car and getting parking tickets.
Oh, it's awful.
But I question the utility of that. I'm okay with them keeping the police, but can I say, without me, I don't mean to sound triumphant here, but is this not exactly what I wrote about my column on Friday? That they would come in, the moderate normies would leave, and all you would be left with was the hardcore, and no one has any incentive to de-escalate this.
No,
like all the power brokers here, either their incentives are to do nothing or to make things worse.
That's right. So anyway, I don't know if we have much more to add about the trucker convoy.
Truckers. If it keeps going, I might go out.
Yeah, and I think you should. I think that'd be great. Anyway, the other thing we want to talk about is this is something that came up in the Dorchester Review. Now, the Dorchester Review is sort of a suspect, not suspect. Oh, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a source. It's edgy. It's a source that I would potentially take with a grain of salt. Let's just put it that way. But the Dorchester Review, you know, they've got a history, particularly of saying really inappropriate, tone deaf, and sometimes just outright wrong things about particularly about Indigenous issues. So, like, I don't totally trust their instincts and sources here. But they came out with something a little while ago, and it just totally went under the radar because there's so much else going on. But they said that the band in Kamloops that had claimed that they had found, you know, 216 bodies of children in the nearby residential school in unmarked graves, no bodies have been found. And this is something that there had been a few people in the midst of that particular social outpouring of grief, grand outpouring of grief. A couple people were quietly mentioning this, and that is the ground penetrating radar that had been used to find these bodies does not have a very high success rate. They can find shapes, but the technology is not that advanced that it can like identify bodies. Like it can just say, hey, there's a weird shape here. Yeah. So this is something that I've been meaning to follow up on and just haven't. And maybe this is just as simple as a call to the band and just sort of confirm or deny kind of thing. And if they deny it, then, you know, I'm just going to let it drop. But I think it is really interesting to note if there haven't been any bodies found. Now, this doesn't negate the fact that we know that there are unmarked graves from residential schools. Like the Truth and Reconciliation Report was very candid about that. Like nobody's under any denial about that. But it is really interesting if there aren't any bodies in this one. I think that is worth noting. This
would be a repeat of what I said above, which is we need a new law to describe the fact that all of our debates become maximally stupid as quickly as possible. Because if there are no bodies at this site, that will fuel deniers or minimizers. Mm-hmm. What it would basically mean is that an enormous number of kids were taken, abused, many of them died. We know that, we all admit that. But we were wrong about whether or not a bunch of them were buried here. But it would be an immediately stupid debate. Like this, all our debates are stupid, and it's making us stupider. But do look into that. I think it would be interesting. We talked about this last year, I think, before we were doing these videos. So I don't know if anyone else would have known we talked about it. I'd be interested in talking to someone who's an expert in the ground penetrating radar, because there are experts in this. I know this is grim. I mean, it's not, you know, it's actually not that grim by our usual standards. You and I are pretty dark. There are experts around the world in, I guess we could call it like kind of forensic anthropology, right? Like people who go in after a genocide in an area, and the neighbors are like, well, one day our ethnic opponents weren't here anymore, and the field at the edge of town was suddenly tilled over. and then people will go with the UN or with Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and they will start looking at fields, and they're like, oh, we found them. Like there are hundreds.
There's a reason why the wheat grew two feet taller that year.
Yeah. So there are people who are experts in reconstructing mass graves, specifically for war crimes investigations. The problem with the residential schools, not impossible to do this, it's the time frame. A lot of the time when we send in guys to investigate mass killing sites, it's years or maybe decades. Some of these sites are more than a century old. And an improperly buried body doesn't last that long.
Well, and then the other problem is like, were these unmarked graves, or were these graves marked with wooden crosses that just disintegrated time? I mean, I think we had this conversation at the time that, you know, some of my own ancestors are buried in sort of paupers grave sites in the prairies, and like they're gone. They're gone. Like the entire grave site's gone. The entire cemetery is gone. There's just nothing. There's nothing there anymore. And that's only, you know, that's only a couple generations, right? So anyway, it's a really morbid, awful thing to do. I mean, I'm not interested in this because I'm interested in denying the horrors of residential schools. However, I do think that facts matter. And if we had a national crisis over preliminary and also I would say that the band in Kamloops was also really candid
about, more reasonable than anyone else.
They were super reasonable about saying this is preliminary data, like we're just, you know, don't freak out. Like they were really good about not overstating what they had found. It was everybody's reaction to them, and the global reaction to it, right? Was when did it.
The Indigenous groups, I think, have been the adults in the room pretty consistent.
100%. Oh, they absolutely have.
And not just in Kamloops, because there was another one out in Atlantic Canada where there'd been this announcement of we've got a team coming. One of these forensic teams are coming in. There's an old residential school site. We're going to check it out. And like there were stories in the press, including the global press, about another site in Canada. And then a few weeks later, like the band puts out a statement going, "No remains were found. Thank you, everybody." Like it was just like part of their investigation. They have been the adults in the room. The rest of us, like I said at the time, when you don't know what your history is, you're easily shocked by it. And Canadians don't know their history.
No, Canadians don't know their history. So anyway, I think that might be worth noting, but I really want to call the band up and just sort of see what they have to say first before I write about it.
See what they say. O'Toole, that's the only thing left on the list. Like we did the live stream on Monday, Tuesday night.
Tuesday? Can't remember a day. That was before today.
Yeah, it was sometime prior to this.
I just wrote a thing for Maclean's that was just basically as politely as possible saying that I think the Conservatives have been idiots, but I think this is terrible timing for them to do what they've done, and they've justified pretty much every sort of centrist and leftist narrative about them by doing this at this particular moment. But okay.
I've
Mr. Poilievre, who knows, right?
I've spent the last few days talking to a lot of conservatives. The spin machine is spun. It's like it's going at full throttle. Everybody's agenda is getting advanced here. I did have an opportunity to have a long interview. It just was published Thursday at TVO with one of O'Toole's guys, someone in his inner circle, and he told me, well, look, it's a long interview, and if the viewers are interested, they can find it at tvo.org under my name. But just a very interesting interview about how all of this played out, right? Because you and I started to hear the reports that this was coming 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. Then it really kicked up a gear on Monday, and then he was gone by Wednesday. Yep. The insider was telling me that just where he was just watching this unfold, how, well, first of all, it was clear to them sooner than it was clear to the broader public, but also just how a lot of other things suddenly make sense. Like you kind of go, oh, okay, that's why that happened, or that's why that happened. To tie a bow on the convoy stuff, I asked, is the convoy what did this? And no, it just blew it out into the open. Like this or something like it was going to happen. This was just an opportunity for it all just started to break down. And look, one of O'Toole's people is going to have a pro O'Toole perspective, right? So this was, I don't pretend the interview was anything but like an O'Toole loyalist saying nice things about O'Toole, but I did ask, why did this happen? Like, like obviously I'm not trying to be a dick, but I'm like, look, I know this is a lousy week for you, but I want to ask, you're telling me how great O'Toole is. Like, I know O'Toole a little. I like the guy. Like, why was he so unpopular with his own party? The vote wasn't even close. It was basically 2/3.
No, he got murdered. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
And
he was taken out behind the chemical sheds and shot.
Yeah, and it wasn't even close. It was not exactly 2-1, but it was not far off of it. And my source thought about it, and it was kind of obviously it was a sad moment in the interview because these people are pretty raw. This is an emotional time for them, and I don't like to be the guy poking the wounds. But the answer basically was there's a lot of reasons. There was a faction in the party that never liked him. There was a faction in the party that wants to go populist, that really thinks that's the right thing to do. That's where their political instincts are. That's where their local community base is. That's what their desires are. That's why they're marching out to the convoyers with coffee and donuts. But the big answer was every time we fought one of these big battles to move the party off a position it was comfortable with to a position that O'Toole thought it needed to have, we alienated 3 or 4 more people. And he goes, so you've got this core mass of people who already don't like us and never will. You've got a core mass of people who think we're nice guys, but we're liberal light and we're not really conservative. And then you have a bunch of people who actually don't mind us, but we lose 3 of them over this fight. We lose 4 of them over this fight. And what it came down to is, have you been seeing the reports lately about how miserable the Conservative caucus is right now? Like, just their caucus meetings have apparently just been absolute bloodbaths, just miserable. And it's just kind of like, you know what? Maybe by kicking out O'Toole, everybody gets a break. Maybe it's a fresh start. I don't think it'll work. I don't think this is going to work.
Nope.
That could be what happened. Any thoughts? I don't know if you do. I honestly don't. Any thoughts on Candace Bergen, the interim leader?
I mean, I've heard nothing but broadly good things about her, so I don't necessarily have a specific response.
The MAGA hat that's going to get her in trouble, isn't it?
The MAGA hat's going to get her in trouble.
I mean, maybe not. I mean,
maybe not. I mean, also, I don't think I make this point in my McLean's column as well. It's like, I can't rule out the possibility that maybe there's going to be a plurality of Canadians who are going to look at Pierre Poilievre and who are going to look at a more populist kind of conservative party and just going to be like, I'm done with the Liberals, fuck it. Or there's going to be enough of those people who are just really sick of the last couple of years of the way the country's going, that they do a bit of a reactionary turn. Like the political instincts might be correct. I think that's the problem. The populist political instincts may very well be correct. It just, if it is correct, Canada's going to a really weird place, like in a really dark place.
Could actually even be weirder than that. You're right. Everything you just said is right and true, but there's actually an even weirder possible outcome, which is that the populist instincts are wrong. They're just dead wrong, but the timing works out anyway. So
that's the other option.
Like the Conservatives go like this weird tack that everybody hates, but like some really embarrassing photo of Justin Trudeau comes out right as the next election happens.
I mean, this is the Doug Ford argument. Doug Ford was absolutely the wrong person at the right time, right? Like, he was just the absolute disastrous person to put at the head of the parade at the moment when the Conservatives were finally destined to win. This could be the scenario. We could have an absolutely disastrous leader at a moment when people are just so effing sick of Trudeau that they'll take anybody.
And it's not, I was talking about this on Twitter a bit before, so I'm re-echoing my own brilliant thoughts here. But I could easily lay out a scenario that happens. Like, it's not even that hard. I'm going to do it in 60 seconds here. A terrible, populist, batshit crazy, mega brain-wormed conservative wins on the basis of party membership sales and becomes the next leader. The party is an absolute disaster. Everybody's miserable, but Trudeau has another scandal come out and has to step down. The party's done with him. The Liberals then bring out the long knives on each other, plus maybe inflation's running a bit high. Some CERB spending went to like the wrong mobster or something. And the stars align in such a way that Liberal vote, which is down to fraction of a % efficiency margins in some areas, stays home, or a couple of people who are just tired of the drama with the Liberals, as Melanie Joly and Chrystia Freeland try to strangle each other on a debate stage somewhere. And they go, fuck it. Whatever. We'll try this conservative guy because he seems funny. And
yeah, that's probably going to happen. That's probably going to be it.
I don't know. I'm not betting on that because a bunch of things would have to happen first. But tell me that can't happen in the next 18 months.
That, in fact, that I think is where the easy money is. That something like that rolls out, and I think we're going to have to bookmark this thing and come back to it. On that note, speaking of bookmarking things and coming back to it, I have to go. So what do you want me to write? What do you want to write?
You give Kamloops a jingle.
Okay.
I don't know if I like all the stuff we're just talking about here for O'Toole and Bergen. I don't know. Do you want me to write up my little scenario there? Do you want me to put that in?
Yeah, I like that scenario.
So I'll do that.
I think that's a good prediction.
I don't know if it is, but I'm like, I'm not even sure it's a prediction per se, but if you are
I would say list these two scenarios. Either it's because I don't think it's going to be another moderate leader. Yeah, I just don't think so. So it's either going to be Canadians get behind the populist because they're ready to get behind the populist, or they get behind the populist because something else happens and it's another Doug Ford style win. Because
it's a blackface video with like.
Yeah, exactly. So okay, so if you do that scenario, you do Kamloops, and then I think we should both try to take a shot at the trucker convoy on the argument that like it's the logistics stupid, it's the trucks stupid, it's the trucks stupid. Like the reason why they haven't cracked head is because it's the trucks.
If you want, I can do that in the military angle. Well, you know what? Let's just message each other later and divide that up. I got to go make dinner.
We'll just divide. I think we both are going to do it. Okay. All right. Talk soon.
All right. See everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.